All right, I'm going to get started. Welcome, welcome. Today's webinar series for May is Motherhood, Money, and Marriage, What Women Often Overlook Before Divorce. If you're here for this webinar, you're in the right place. And so I'm going to get started, but I'll tell you a little bit about me first before we get into the substance. My name is Attorney Sharice Williams, and I am licensed in Maryland and Washington, D.C. And I do divorce, but I also do the collaborative process. I use collaborative also for prenuptials or postnuptial agreements. I also do litigation. I can help people with custody, child support, post-divorce enforcement matters, as well as estate planning as when it comes to wills, power of attorneys, and trusts. So those are the areas that I practice. And before we get started again, I want to go over some housekeeping matters with you so you'll know a little bit about the format that we're going to take. So tonight, as you know, we're being recorded and there's a chat box, so you can feel free to communicate in the chat box. You can connect with people, you can ask questions. I will leave some time at the very end of the presentation to answer questions. So if you have them, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I also had some pre-submitted questions. And most importantly, I just want everyone to know that this webinar is for educational and informational purposes only. It's not to give legal advice. It doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. So if you do want that specific guidance, then you can reach me at my office, which is the number is on this slide. Now, we can get into the heart of this because every situation is different. So let's talk about why we are here. Yes, we're in the month of May, and this month we celebrated Mother's Day. And when we think about Mother's Day, there's a lot of things that we think about with mothers, and we celebrate them. And for some women, there's a lot of thinking going on. There's reflection. They think about what's going on in their lives, how they want to go about the future and the past and the present. And the truth is, many mothers are doing that, and they're planning for long-term things. They may not say all of these things out loud, but others are considering whether or not they want to get a divorce. So, as they consider many of these things come to mind, they may confide in their friends, they may confide in their family, they may be watching their husband's every move. I mean, everyone handles this differently. So, in thinking of creating this webinar, I wanted to kind of talk about how mothers sometimes have to consider how to evaluate for their kids. They want to think about their finances and they think about their overall like financial outlook and the rest of their lives. And so when they're doing this, unfortunately, often they may be planning without a lot of the right information. So during this webinar, I thought about what you need to help make a plan before you make any moves towards getting a divorce. So next, we're going to get into like the custody aspect, since we're talking about mothers and the reality of that aspect, since I'm sure it's very important at the forefront of a lot of mothers' minds. So one thing that I often find when I'm representing mothers is they're not necessarily prepared for the idea that they may have to share parenting in some form. And in Maryland, most custody arrangements involve shared parenting. Now, often people may have heard of 50-50, but it doesn't necessarily mean 50-50. So even if you have handled everything during your marriage or majority of things during your marriage when it comes to a lot of the parenting, it doesn't mean that that situation is going to be what happens if there is a separation and ultimately a divorce. So, looking at what you do versus what the other parent does is not necessarily the best lens to approach planning. So, um, in the court system, there is this presumption or just this idea, and I'll use presumption lightly because DC has a specific presumption, but Maryland there is this idea that both parents start off at least with the idea that they're fit in some form or fashion. So looking at that, Maryland is more distinctive in that they are very they look more into the best interests of the children. So they're not just automatically going to rubber stamp 50-50 or some type of shared schedule that's like equal in time if that's not in the children's best interest. So, in looking at what you as a mother may or may not want to do, you got to think about how you're going to be able to emotionally handle some of the loss of control, and then also preparing your children for spending time with their co-parent. And doing this, there may be different ways to do this. So mentally, you do have to prepare yourself. And just because the other parent may or may not do things the same way that you do, that is not necessarily going to impact their ability to have that quality time with their child. So you will have to learn to relinquish control and co-parent from what I call a child-centered place. And you may have hurt, you may have fear, and of course, those feelings are very valid, but you will have to figure out how and ways to cope unless you have a case, and these are all very fact specific, where you do have evidence that the other parent is a danger to the child. And that's the key word, because some co-parents are a danger to the actual you, the mother, but not necessarily the child. But I know this is sometimes interrelated, so we don't ignore that. And you're if you have a lawyer, you do have to tie those things together. But looking at whether they're a danger to the child's actual mental, physical, and emotional health, or even their education, and that's not always easy to prove. So in reality, it is best to think about what it looks like to co-parent with some form of shared schedule with that other parent early, if you're having those thoughts of separation and you're planning ahead. So this is again something I've noticed over the years, and I think I find that mothers have a very, very hard time with this part. So that's why I wanted to kind of start off with that first. So now let's talk about how you can possibly test this and think about that shared parenting time and how that can equal the cost of, and child support in that arena. So if you're thinking about how to plan, and you know you have a spouse, whether they know you want to get a divorce or not, this could still apply. You could still possibly do something where you're still living together, but you give the other parent that full responsibility on certain days. I know that may be a change, and maybe your spouse may get suspicious, but ultimately it's for the benefit of the child. This is still not really about you, but possibly let the other parent have that responsibility to handle meals, school routines, all the routines, the emotional and all the needs that the kid has. So if they're running up to them and want that attention and they are having a bad day and they're scared or crying, and if they have activities they need to be transported to, let the other parent do that on certain days and see how that actually works so that you can observe and you may be less rushing to judgment if you give the co-parent that experience, because in marriages you have a right to set up your parenting the way you want. So if it just so happens you were the one taking the full responsibility, you now this other parent hasn't had that opportunity, right? So it wasn't really fair to say whether they can or cannot. So this allows them to see what they can handle, and also the child to see them handling it. So you're looking at it and giving that. So this is a good way to give some comfort and stability. Maybe it will, maybe it'll raise your anxiety some more, but at least you'll have something to go on other than coming to the lawyer and saying, well, they never did it. And, just making that assumption that they can't, because that usually is not going to be effective in court. So, when you're separate, you have to understand you're not going to really control that anymore. So it's better now to kind of get a bird's eye view of what's happening in when they have that full responsibility. And then if there are things that you want changed, maybe that is the time, if you have a good relationship, at least from the co-parenting perspective, that you can mention that and say, hey, maybe we can work on this, or this is how Johnny responded to that. And those are real conversations that you can have to kind of see how do you communicate if you have a disagreement about specific ways that you parent. Okay, so it's an important for that reason too. So this makes sense because a child, when you separate, are going to spend is going to spend time in two homes. And when it comes to looking at the cost, if the child is spending equal time in both parents' homes, meaning you have more of a truly shared schedule, then the financial outcome is going to be less. But if you have more parenting time, more days of the weeks, summertime breaks, then you're probably, if you're not the breadwinner and the custody child support calculator is calculated, then you may get more money. So custody and the time that's spent, the overnight schedule, is does have a direct cause and effect on child support. However, you're not going to focus on that because courts don't like it. And so it shouldn't be the overriding reason that you come up with the schedule. It still, again, needs to be in the child's best interest. But it's something to think about, again, if you're planning and how you're planning. So that is something that you can do. Next, we're going to talk about alimony and the reality of alimony and possibly your lifestyle and how that may shift. So, when we look at Maryland and when we talk about alimony, most alimony is going to be what we coin as rehabilitative, right? So, rehabilitative means you're going to be going from one phase to another. So if you are the stay-at-home spouse, or if you work but you just don't work enough and your spouse has more income, then this could be a time period that you utilize to get to a place where you are self-supporting. So if that means you need to take more classes, go to school altogether, if you need to just have time to advance in the career that you do have, that is a time that can be used to supplement that income that you'll lose from separating households. It is very difficult to get what some may label indefinite or permanent alimony. And so you don't want to utilize that thought process early on unless there is a reason. For example, if you have a disability, or if you are an older client and you're in a situation where you are possibly a senior and you've retired and you've been married for 30 plus years, and there is not a high likelihood that you're going to re-enter the job market or enter altogether, even at that age. Even if you have your degrees and had all these things, if you were not in the market actively, then yes, you may be a candidate for what we call permanent alimony. Those are fact specific and a case by case basis. So just depending on your situation, this is where talking to a lawyer would be super important for custody, alimony discussion. So you understand what that looks like. And so you may not be ready to file for divorce at that moment, but it's still a planning tool that you need to think about. So that is kind of how alimony plays into it. And what is your lifestyle? What are you guys what is going to be sustainable when you separate? And so you need to plan for a real and have realistic expectations. So thinking about it early is super important for the mothers once you are really ready to go forward with filing for divorce. Now, we're going to talk about how emotions versus being strategic and making decisions. So we all know that when you're in a marriage where your marriage may or may not be someplace that you want to stay for the long haul, you may make decisions that are very emotional. You may be going through different arguments. You might discover infidelity. It could be you could discover that there's been some financial issues. There may be financial coercion and control. There may be a lot of things, and you may often feel overwhelmed as a mother, even if you're doing carrying a lot of the work that goes along with that, along with maybe having a job. So those emotions are going to be there and they're valid. But when you're thinking about decisions that you're going to make for your family, long term and even short term, you want to be strategic. So thinking about how you separate and deal with facts and emotions. It's important. So, again, this is another reason to discuss with a lawyer early so that you kind of know how to plan out the future, even when you're going through those rough times, what the possibility will be post divorce. So, there are different processes that you can use to divorce. So that's another reason why this is a big strategic decision. Collaborative divorce is a process. I mentioned that earlier. And so looking at how you may utilize that versus, let's say, mediation or going through litigation. Those are all processes that you use to go through a divorce, and they make a big difference financially and emotionally, mentally. And so with families with kids, I recommend collaborative divorce. I'm a big fan of that. And so my firm does offer that process. So that's a plug for that, because you don't know how all lawyers are not able to do that process. And if your family is a family that may be eligible, that might be something that you want to talk to a lawyer about and understand what that is, because you may not have never have heard of it, and that's okay. So thinking about the strategy and taking out the emotions, super important. So next we're going to talk about the financial. And this is a big thing because divorce is emotional, it's financial, and it's legal. So we're looking at the financial investigation. And I use that term because sometimes you do have to investigate. When you're married, not everyone knows all of the financial situation or income, debt that's going on between the two of you. That's between you and your spouse. So there's no judgment in that, but it does impact when a lawyer, when you come to me and you're looking to find out what's going on with the other side, and let's say they don't want, they're supposed to turn over information but they don't want to. So now if you're planning ahead but you know you're not filing for divorce right now, you may have time to investigate what's going on financially. So looking at, don't assume that you know everything, all right? So you need to start thinking about what income streams are you going to look to do if you're a stay-at-home spouse. Are there work from home opportunities? And if you had joint accounts during the marriage, even some of those could be in jointly in both of your names, or you may have individual accounts, but that may still be considered marital property. And there is the definition of how marital property is identified. So just because an account is in one person's name does not mean that it can't be identified as marital property. So you want to think about what bank accounts, you want to look at reviewing bank statements, knowing what's in there, tax returns. Don't just sign the tax return as the joint spouse and not ever look at it and know what the income and statements say. Make sure you're actually taking the time to review. You may even ask your spouse to sit down and have meetings about your finances, and that's okay, so that you know if mail's coming in and you see accounts you don't understand or know, and I won't even say understand, but you just never knew if your spouse had an account or a credit card or something in that particular name. If it's not just like a application for like a credit card, you may want to take note of what you saw, because sometime coming to your lawyer and just knowing they could have a bank account in this bank is helpful, because at that point, depending on the method and process you use, there may be a way to get that information. So just look at how things are coming in and out of your house. You may want to run credit reports or at least have access to those. So those are important because they kind of lay out the historically things that may or may not be going on. I've had cases where spouses have filed for bankruptcy and done other things, and the other spouse just didn't know they may have been sued civilly. So this is a big deal. So knowing what is going on financially, start to investigate, start to ask questions, know what exists. That's super important. Know what your mortgage is, know who the lender is, know how to contact these individuals. So put your investigative hat on. If you have an HOA, make sure you know that that's current. Make sure there's nothing that possibly could put a lien on your house when it comes time to sell it. So understand that, and definitely credit card debt, also cars and how that's paid for. All that clarity will be much better for you when and if it's time for you to get ready to file for divorce. So that's a super important thing for you just in this process and this planning, because this is all about the planning, mother, since you're planners and you run the show oftentimes when it comes to certain aspects of the marriage. Now, let's talk about access, legal awareness, and communication. When we're talking about that, again, I'm talking a little deeper. You may not have access and control of everything because, again, things may be in the other spouse's name. That can create a risk for you. I've had cases where there is a separation, but let's say there's a back utility bill and only one person's name's on that bill. So then you may not be able to get copies of that unless there's a formal request. Things can be slowed down, subpoenas. So possibly if you can get your name added to those bills as a secondary, it's a good idea. I recommend it. If you're a new bride or groom, it's good to again have your name added to these accounts and just understand that it's more beneficial in the long run if you need to get access to that information. Again, you can look at public records to see if there's any cases against your spouse or anything like that. And so it's you can also look at Maryland Judiciary Case Search. That's like a database where there's case information about people that you can look at. If you haven't heard of that, that's a way to look up and do a semi background check. There's are companies that do more extensive, but that's public record information that Maryland is required to have. So this is a process of understanding what you're going to be dealing with fully and think about how you're going to communicate. If you have a situation that you feel unsafe and you're not able to have that communication, then you may want to put things in writing if you are separating. If you're at that point where somebody moves out and you're requesting certain things, put it in writing that you wanted to have a copy of this or you want to know about this. Or if they cut off your phone bill, all of these things have happened in past cases. If you decide to leave and they're trying to cut off stuff that you have access to not allow you to move forward or be comfortable. So that's important to keep requesting to turn things back on or give me access to this so that if you go to your lawyer, you can kind of see the way that communication has broken down and your inability to have basic things that you did in the lifestyle of your marriage. So keep that and be safe if you need protective orders and things like that. Every marriage is different. Then you can seek out that stuff as well. Next, we are going to talk about your beautiful children that you created, even if in the marriage. So, looking at this process and continuing on the path of like preparation, there is no one path, right? I mentioned earlier that you can choose to try to settle your case. You can choose to litigate your case, and that's the format that most people are aware of, meaning you're going to file in court first and go through the court process. Even though in litigation you can eventually settle, but let's say you can't, and then there's a trial at the end. The settlement, which can be done through cooperation outside of court, and that can be through a lawyer talking to a lawyer for your spouse, or you guys can go to mediation and work that through a mediator. And there are the pros and cons of that. And then there's collaborative divorce, which is a specific process for settlement where you're running the show and in control. And this process is one that a lot more people should do because when you have kids, it allows your kids to be at the forefront. And also, you have the necessary individuals if you have financial separation that you need to take care of, the right professional will be involved, like a financial that can help you with that. And then also you if you have communication issues, you can have and it's necessary to have someone who's going to handle the communication process. And then the lawyers who advocate for you. But instead of us fighting each other, we work together. And that's not typically how divorce is run, but has better outcomes because your goal is to have that separation and be able to co-parent when you have kids, even if you don't get along. Those kids still need both of you in their lives. So it is a process that's helpful if you want to have a co-parenting relationship post-divorce. So your goal in those situations when it comes to settlement and collaborative is to have a marriage separation agreement. And sometimes people want to stay married, right? So if you do, you can have a post-nuptial agreement. and that will keep you married. And you may, if there was infidelity, for example, you may say, well, if this happens again, then we'll seek out a divorce. So your kids, it's important that you want to let them know, and have them have consistency. So if you want to think about therapy, because divorce is like a death to children, it can be for some kids, they're all going to have their own emotions, and but the bottom line is a lot of literature and things show that kids really take these things, and some internalize it, others have their outbursts and different things that happen. So it's important that you're prepared and thinking ahead, like, who can I get to have therapy for my children in the event? And just because they're not having outbursts and having problems doesn't mean that they don't need to talk to someone outside of the two of you. And don't put them in the middle. Don't talk to them about this other spouse. It's very important that they are not used as tools and weapons in your divorce. So keep the child-centered approach, and it'll have a better mental, it'll be better mentally for your kids. And then also, if you try to like test out again the custody aspects and have different days where each parent is doing something, you'll build that stability and consistency that will help when you're going to your lawyer. If you want to save money overall, doing these preparation things when you come to your lawyer and you both are now in a place, whether you want to get divorced right now, or some people still resistant because that's just natural, it still sets you up for a better, shorter, productive divorce than just fighting for years and animosity and all of those things. So that is super important. Um, and think about all of your options, how you're going to fund it. You may need to start saving up money and put aside things if you're not in control of the bank accounts and the different things that are going to be involved, with this divorce, because you're going to have to pay, and it's not always cheap to do so. So that is the preparation that you need to then get to the point where you're deciding on the process for the divorce. So you're going to decide on the process. Your kids are going to be ready to engage in help and therapy or whatever it is, and then that'll be important for you when you go to your lawyer. So now the thing about the final like things and thoughts are that don't be afraid. Just think about your awareness, and divorce is not just emotional. It is financial, structural, and there's long-term planning. So those are the substantive aspects of the presentation. But now there's a few questions that were provided that I'm gonna look to answer so that people can have some information that they may not have had during the presentation. So one, it says, if I ignored financial red flags for years because I trusted my spouse, is what how is that going to impact you? So that is something that happens alone. You're not alone. Most people in long-term marriages divide the responsibilities. So you may not know everything about the finances, and that's okay. Don't beat yourself up. That's why I did mention earlier that it's important to kind of have a plan and start doing some investigation if you can, because that'll give you a jump start. Um, Another question was, what if the other co-parent becomes more involved once divorce is discussed? Well, again, strategy. Some people might think, well, I don't want them to because I want to have all the custody. But again, this is not about you when it comes to the kids. It's about the children. That's how the courts look at it. So you have to kind of step aside emotionally and understand that they should get more involved. And unless they're doing something to physically harm the children, that is not a bad thing. So you should be happy that that's happening, and because in the long run, that'll be a good thing for your kids. Now, if they're using the kids to hurt you, then that's another conversation that you can have with your lawyer and figure out how to make sure that that's not something that's going to terrorize you and the kids for a long time. So there's all different facts, and things have happened in all these cases I've had over the years that you kind of do have to pause in some situations, but in general, it's a good thing. So don't take it the wrong way. So, looking again, I wanted to thank everyone who joined us for this webinar today. And if you do need more personalized service consultation, if you want to hire me, then contacting us at 240-499-8255. 8569 to schedule that consultation. I enjoy doing these webinars to bring you information. I thank you again for joining us. Take care until next time.